Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're jumping right in today with a really interesting paper. The geometry of self-verification in a task-specific reasoning model.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
So the big takeaway here, the paper really pins down how a model checks its own work, specifically in an arithmetic task. We're talking about specific attention heads, certain GLU vectors.
Exactly. They train a model on this puzzle game, Countdown, use some clever techniques with preference tuning.
Right, which made the model's reasoning steps super structured.
And then they attacked it from both ends, top down, looking at outputs and working back.
And bottom up, focusing on specific components like attention heads.
And the really cool part, they narrowed it down to potentially just 3 attention heads being critical for this self-check.
3 heads. That level of detail, understanding how it verifies itself, that's huge for making these systems more reliable.
Absolutely. It's a big deal for interpretability. Okay, so that's the snapshot.
Let's get into the nitty-gritty then.
Okay, so for anyone deep into AI interpretability, this is a great case study. They used a very controlled setup to see what's happening inside when the model checks itself.
And the task was Countdown.
Yeah, Countdown. You get numbers, a target number, and you have to combine the numbers using arithmetic to hit that target.
Like, you have 20, 14, 40, and the target is 28. Something like that from the paper.
Exactly like that example. But the paper shows the model trying things out, like 40, 14, 20 equals, and that is 10.
And it explicitly says not 10 or something similar.
Right. And then for the correct one, 40, 14, 20 equals 28, it says this works.
Okay. And the clever bit you mentioned was having the target number right there in the input.
Yes, exactly. That strongly hints that attention mechanisms, how the model focuses, are probably involved in checking the answer against that target.
Which makes it easier to analyze.
Much easier. It simplifies things.
So why this specific task, Countdown?
Well, it forces the model to do some kind of search, right? Which is fundamental to reasoning.
Makes sense.
And having that target number right there in the context gives the model a clear thing to check against. It just makes spotting the verification mechanism more likely.
Got it. And you mentioned mode collapse from preference tuning. That sounds like something you usually don't want, but it was helpful here.
Right. Normally, yeah, you want variety. Yeah. But for interpretability, that variability makes things messy. So by using preference tuning this way, they deliberately caused this mode collapse. The model ended up spitting out those really predictable chains of thought, always with the this works or not answer.
So that consistency was key for the analysis.
Totally. A gold mine. It means you can directly compare the model's internal state when it's saying, yep, got it right, versus nope, that's wrong.
Okay, clear setup. So then the top-down analysis, how did that work?
So top-down means starting from the output, those verification tokens like this works, and tracing back through the layers. They used a technique called logit lens. Basically, it looks at how the hidden state activations, layer by layer, correlate with what the model is about to output.
So comparing the internal states when it's about to say something positive, like this works.
Right, which they called a leave lens.
Versus when it's about to say something negative, invalid.
Exactly. Comparing those two states lets you see which internal patterns are linked to the act of verifying.
And what popped out from that high-level view?
This is where it gets really interesting about the model's internal language. Late in the network, specific GLU Vectors gated linear units, part of the architecture, lit up for verification-related tokens.
Lit up how?
Well, for the correct attempts, these GLUs activated strongly for tokens like success, yes, even bingo.
Bingo, okay.
And for the incorrect ones, they saw activation for Chinese tokens like tin does not conform or not okay.
Wow, that's quite direct, little internal flags.
Pretty much. And table 2 in the paper shows this really weird, fascinating correlation. English tokens for correct, Chinese tokens for incorrect.
Strange. What do they make of that?
They think it points to some underlying geometric structure in the model's embedding space, how it organizes valid versus invalid.
Okay, so these GLUs seem like strong indicators, but how did they know they were causing the verification, not just, reflecting it?
Good question. They used linear probes. Think of them as simple classifiers trained at each layer.
Trained to do what?
Trained to predict, just based on the hidden state at that layer, whether the model was about to output this, it works, or not. It doesn't.
Okay.
And the probes were really accurate, like over 90% accuracy after just a few layers, according to their figure 4. That strongly suggests the success-failure info is encoded right there in the hidden states.
And that accuracy let them zero in on the specific GLU vectors, the GLU valid and GLU invalid ones.
Exactly. They looked at which GLU output vectors lined up best with the directions the probes identified, this direction and the not direction.
Yeah.
That pinpointed the GLUs doing the most work signaling correct versus incorrect. Hence, GLU valid and GLU invalid.
And checking what those vectors represent confirmed the Logit findings, those verification tokens again.
Correct. Table 2 shows that clearly. But then, the crucial experiment, they tried turning off the GLU valid vectors.
Like silencing them?
Yeah, basically. Figure 1c shows it did slightly reduce the chance of the model outputting success tokens, but it didn't completely stop the verification.
Okay. So GLUs are involved, but maybe not the whole picture.
Precisely. They're part of the mechanism, but something else is going on too.
Which brings us to the bottom-up analysis, right? Looking at specific components first.
Yep, bottom up. Here they focused on attention heads. The idea or hypothesis was that since the target number is right there in the input, maybe some attention heads specialize in comparing the intermediate calculation results to that target number.
That makes total sense. If you're aiming for 28, you need to keep checking against 28.
Exactly. So they looked for what they called previous token heads. These are heads that pay a lot of attention to tokens earlier in the sequence.
Okay.
Specifically, heads that looked back at the target number token at a key moment. TANs. They found 25 heads like this.
25. And where were they located?
Mostly in the first half of the network, before layer 22. Just one outlier later on at layer 31. Kind of interesting.
And what happened when they poked at these heads?
This was a major finding. They did causal interventions, basically disabling these heads by zeroing out their output weights.
Yeah.
And it broke the verification. Figure 2 shows it pretty starkly. Without these specific heads working properly, the model often couldn't tell it had found the right answer, even when it had.
Wow. So these attention heads seem absolutely essential for the model to know it succeeded.
It looks that way, and this is where the top-down and bottom-up stories meet.
How so?
The researchers' hypothesis became, maybe these previous token heads are the things activating the GLU Valid Vectors they found earlier.
Okay. So the heads do the comparison, and they signal the result by activating those specific GLUs.
That's the proposed mechanism. And to connect these, they use the idea of receptive fields borrowed from neuroscience.
Receptive fields for GLU neurons.
Yeah. Equation 8 defines it as the input subspace that makes a GLU neuron fire. They figured the overlap in the receptive fields of all the GLU valid vectors could define a kind of verification subspace.
Like a dedicated zone in the model's activation space just for self-checking.
Exactly. So then the challenge was, which specific attention heads are talking to this subspace?
Right. How did they narrow it down from those 25 previous token heads?
They came up with a scoring function, equation 9. It measures how much each previous token head's output activates the GLU valid vectors. It's related to how information flows between layers.
Okay, a scoring system.
And using that score, they isolated just 3 specific heads, L17H14, L17H11, and L17H10.
Layer 17 heads 14, 11, and 10. That's incredibly specific.
It really is. And figure 2 shows that turning off just these 3 heads was enough to reliably break the model's verification ability.
That's powerful. Just 3 components having such a massive impact.
Yeah, it really suggests you can find these very targeted points of control or understanding. And figure 3 backs it up further. Disabling those 3 heads causes a big drop in the activation of the GLU valid vectors.
It all connects. Now, what about the GLU invalid vectors and these antipodal vectors mentioned?
Right. They noticed something interesting in the interventions. Turning off both GLU Valid and GLU Invalid was more effective at breaking verification than just turning off GLU Valid.
Why would that be?
Well, their explanation involves the antipodal directions, basically the opposite direction in the embedding space. It seems the opposite directions of both GLU Valid and GLU Invalid also encode verification tokens, shown in red in Table 2. Plus, the model they used has SILU activations. So even inactive GLU Invalid neurons have small negative values. If you only zero out GLU Valid, those small negative values in GLU Invalid might still slightly nudge things towards the success direction.
So zeroing out both removes even that subtle influence.
Exactly. It cleans up the signal completely. It's like you need to silence both the yes signal and the not no signal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Like needing both positive and negative confirmation channels to be manipulated for full control.
Kind of. Now, the researchers are careful about limitations, of course.
Right, it's just one task.
Exactly. Countdown is specific. Verification relies on comparing against that target in the context. What about reasoning that uses, general knowledge?
That would be harder to track.
Much harder. The mechanisms might be different, more distributed, harder to pin down.
And they also say they found necessary components, but maybe not the whole circuit.
Correct. The scoring function for finding those 3 heads had some simplifications. There could be other bits involved. But still, finding any necessary components, especially just 3, is a big step.
Definitely. But they do suggest the findings might generalize somewhat because of shared geometry and embeddings.
Yeah, that's their thinking.
Yeah.
Since many LLMs seem to structure their knowledge in geometrically similar ways, the types of components involved here, specific attention heads interacting with specific activation patterns like GLUs, might show up in other models too.
Even if the specifics differ.
Right. The basic principles might carry over.
Okay, so let's recap. This deep dive showed us, in this countdown task, specific GLU vectors act like signals for whether a reasoning step is correct.
The success and failure flags.
And a tiny set of attention heads, just 3 in this case, seem crucial for doing the actual checking against the target.
And the top-down and bottom-up analyses really converge nicely to point at this mechanism.
It's a really detailed picture of an internal process.
Absolutely. And for the technical folks listening, the implications for interpretability are pretty clear. This is how we start moving away from black boxes.
Right, understanding the parts.
If we know which components handle things like self-verification, maybe we can monitor them, maybe improve reliability, build more trust. Imagine watching these signals in real time on much harder tasks.
Yeah, that's the future potential. It definitely leaves you thinking, if this is what a verification circuit looks like for arithmetic puzzles.
What does it look like for, say, writing code or generating creative text or complex reasoning?
Exactly. Are there analogous circuits? Can we find them? And, what does it really mean if we can pinpoint and maybe even tweak the ways AI systems decide if they think they're right?
Lots to chew on there. How reliable are systems if their self-assessment can be understood or even manipulated?
Definitely food for thought. Thanks for walking through this paper with me.
My pleasure. Really interesting work.